My Weirder-est School, Book Number 11. Mrs. Stoker is a Joker. Written by Dan Gutman. Pictures by Jim Palott. Chapter 6. But seriously. We were in the vomitorium eating lunch. I had a sandwich. Michael had a sandwich. Alexia had a sandwich. Everybody had a sandwich except for Ryan. He had a witch sand. That's a sandwich with the meat on the outside. Ryan is weird. So, did Mrs. Stoker give you detention? Asked Neil. No, Andrea and I replied. Is she going to tell your parents you were talking during DEAR time? Asked Emily. No, I said. She just made us listen to 1,100,000 bad jokes. I looked up. Mrs. Stoker was talking to some 5th graders at the other end of the vomitorium. Oh no, said Andrea. Here she comes. She's going to tell more jokes. Mrs. Stoker was walking toward our table. Hide your face, I said. Maybe she won't notice us. We all looked at the ground. If you don't want a grown-up to talk to you, look at the ground. That's the first rule of being a kid. It's too late, whispered Andrea. She sees us. Mrs. Stoker stopped right in front of our table. Hi, boys and girls, she said cheerfully. Hey, did you ever notice that lunch ladies wear those funny hairnets? What's up with that? Hello, Mrs. Stoker, we all said. You know, she told us, the clock in this lunchroom is slow. Yeah, it's always going back for seconds. Get it? Going back for seconds? Actually, I'm kind of mad at that clock. It really gets me ticked off. I tried my best to laugh at her jokes, but it wasn't easy. But seriously, said Mrs. Stoker, I opened my refrigerator door the other day and the carrot was blushing. Don't ask why the carrot was blushing, I whispered under my breath. Why was the carrot blushing? Asked Emily. It saw the salad dressing, said Mrs. Stoker. Get it? Speaking of salad, did you hear about the lettuce that won a race? Yeah, it was ahead the whole time. There was no stopping her. She just kept telling joke after joke. My cookie had to go to the hospital, Mrs. Stoker told us. Yeah, it felt crummy. And my baby strawberries are always crying. Well, their parents were in a jam. And my teddy bear never likes to eat dessert. He says he's stuffed. Hey, what did one plate say to the other plate? Dinner is on me. Get it? Wow, Mrs. Stoker sure knows a lot of food jokes. I looked at Michael. Michael looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at Neil. Neil looked at Alexia. Alexia looked at me. We were all looking at each other. I think it's time for us to go to recess, Alexia said. Yeah, we all agreed, picking up our trays. Is it recess already? Asked Mrs. Stoker. Hey, why do they call it recess? Is that when you cess again? What's a cess? I say the best candy to eat after lunch is recess pieces. Get it? We were going to clear off our plates and run out of there before she could tell any more jokes. But that's when the weirdest thing in the history of the world happened. Mrs. Jaffe came into the vomitorium. She walked right up and stuck her face a few inches from Mrs. Stoker's face. She looked mad. We need to talk, said Mrs. Jaffe. Is there a problem? Asked Mrs. Stoker. Yeah, Mrs. Jaffe replied. When Mr. Klutz retired, I should have been named the new principal. You are totally unqualified. I have more experience than you. I'm smarter than you. And one more thing, I'm funnier than you. Ooh, everybody oohed. Oh, snap, said Ryan. A hush fell over the vomitorium. How dare you, said Mrs. Stoker. You take that back. No, said Mrs. Jaffe. This school ain't big enough for the both of us. Mrs. Jaffe and Mrs. Stoker were almost nose to nose. Are you challenging me, asked Mrs. Stoker, to a joke-off? That's right, said Mrs. Jaffe. Meet me on the playground, after school. Ooh, everybody oohed. I'll be there, said Mrs. Stoker. Chapter 7. The Big Joke-Off. I'd never heard of a joke-off. I didn't know what it was, but the news about the big joke-off between Mrs. Stoker and Mrs. Jaffe spread around the school like wildfire. Well, not exactly. That would have been dangerous. But when the dismissal bell rang, just about everybody who wasn't taking the bus home went out to the playground. We were all buzzing, which was weird because we're not bees. 5 minutes later, Mrs. Stoker came out of the school and walked over to the middle of the blacktop. Then Mrs. Jaffe came out. She was holding a book called 1001 Insults for All Occasions. They both looked really serious. Mrs. Stoker is gonna crush Mrs. Jaffe, I heard some fourth grader say. She's a professional comedian. You can do it, Mrs. Jaffe, shouted some other kid. We formed a big circle around Mrs. Jaffe and Mrs. Stoker. Everybody stopped talking. I am the rightful principal of elementary school, said Mrs. Jaffe. In your dreams, said Mrs. Stoker. I was hired fair and square. I got the job. Why don't you go count the spoons in the lunchroom? Ooh, everybody oohed. There's only one way to settle this, said Mrs. Jaffe. A joke-off. You and me. No jokes barred. The first one to laugh is the loser. The other one gets to be principal. Agreed? Agreed, said Mrs. Stoker. I guess joke-offs are one of those things that grown-ups do when kids aren't around, because Mrs. Jaffe and Mrs. Stoker seemed to know exactly what to do. They shook hands. Then they stood back to back. Then they walked 5 paces away from each other and turned around. You should have been there. There was electricity in the air. Well, not really. We already discussed that in Chapter 3. Mrs. Jaffe went first. She opened her book. If you were any dumber, she said to Mrs. Stoker, somebody would have to water you twice a week. Ooh, everybody oohed. Oh, snap, said Ryan. Mrs. Stoker didn't crack a smile. That was totally pathetic, she said. I would say you're as dumb as a rock, but at least a rock can hold a door open. Ooh, everybody oohed. Oh, snap, said Ryan. Mrs. Jaffe didn't laugh. She was frantically flipping through the pages in her book. Nice try, Mrs. Jaffe said. You know, I thought of you today. It reminded me to take out the garbage. Ooh, everybody oohed. Oh, snap, said Ryan. I fail to see the humor, said Mrs. Stoker. You're the reason why they have to put directions on shampoo bottles. And by the way, your face makes onions cry. Ooh, everybody oohed. Oh, snap, said Ryan. That's pretty funny, said Mrs. Jaffe, but not funny enough. You are more disappointing than an unsalted pretzel. Your teeth are so bad you can eat apples through a fence. Someday you'll go far, and I hope you stay there. The last time I saw something like you, I flushed it. Ooh, everybody oohed. Oh, snap, said Ryan. For a second, it looked like Mrs. Stoker was about to laugh, but she just sneered at Mrs. Jaffe. Is that the best you've got? She said. It's pathetic. You remind me of a slinky. Why do I remind you of a slinky? Asked Mrs. Jaffe. You serve no purpose, said Mrs. Stoker, and everybody smiles when you get pushed down the stairs. Ooh, everybody oohed. Oh, snap, said Ryan. For a second, Mrs. Jaffe didn't react. Maybe she didn't know what a slinky was. Then the corners of her mouth turned up a little. There was a twinkle in her eye. She looked like she was trying not to laugh. And then she cracked up. Ha ha ha, said Mrs. Jaffe. Slinky! That's a good one. Mrs. Stoker is the winner, somebody shouted as the rest of us clapped and cheered. She gets to be principal. Ha ha ha, said Mrs. Jaffe, doubled over laughing. You win the joke off. You're funnier than me. I admit it. Maybe you should quit education, Mrs. Stoker said as she walked back toward the school. You should become an archaeologist. Why should I become an archaeologist? Asked Mrs. Jaffe. Because your career is in ruins, Mrs. Stoker shouted as she walked inside. Ooh, everybody oohed. Oh, snap, said Ryan.